Hello, and welcome to Best Case Scenario. Today, we'll be talking about why science fiction is so darn dystopian, and asking the question, does it have to be? I've been an avid reader of science fiction novels and a pretty voracious consumer of science fiction movies and television, even the not-so-great ones, and the bad ones, and whatever the heck this is.
I just want to do whatever serves the corporation best, sir. Very admirable.
Sometimes, I actually like some of the bad ones, but that's my problem. What I want to talk about here is why the genre has been so dominated by an almost singularly pessimistic view of the future. I've been thinking about this phenomena for a while now, and I do want to state up front that I believe the answers to this question are wide-ranging and complicated, spanning fields as diverse as psychology, economics, philosophy, and political history. You could probably write a book focusing on each one of these areas, as well as others, and a few of those books have already been written. We'll have a look at one or two of them. But first, let's back up and take a minute to establish that there actually is a generally pessimistic view of the future that's almost become inherent to the science fiction genre as a whole.
Maybe so. This much is probably true. The men who sent us on this journey are long since dead and gone. You who are reading me now are a different breed. I hope a better one. I leave the 20th century with no regrets.
If you're like me and read and watch a lot of sci-fi, you already know that the vast majority of science fiction that deals with the future envisions a pretty bleak one. But in case you're more of a rom-com person, maybe you recognize this Max Gone Mad. Or this one. Well, it wasn't the first dystopian film by a long shot. The enduring popularity of the original 1979 Mad Max, and I should note that it was the most profitable film of its time, probably set off a whole generation of after-the-collapse movies and books that fed off the general high level of anxiety around nuclear war. For example, there's This One on a Train, with nifty commentary about the general unfairness of political systems under the constraints of scarcity, and This One on a Boat. Heck, I even found one set on a plane just for the Dr. Seuss of it all. Here they're trying to outrun the apocalypse in an Airbus. And this one, from 1959, is on the beach, with Gregory Peck, Ava Gardner, and Fred Astaire waiting for nuclear annihilation and definitely not singing in the rain. In the future, it seems, you may have to escape from New York, and then escape from Los Angeles. Some people never learn. Bunkers aren't a bad option, as long as you do a background check on your roommate beforehand. Like these two did. Sort of. Well, that didn't turn out so great either. The whole young adult fiction craze caught fire, with this lovely young lady being forced into the double indignity of having to fight for survival in a dystopian future, only to emerge victorious and then be forced to wear this world-ending outfit. And this one. Now that's catastrophic. The genre spawned what seemed like a never-ending series about groups of teens fighting to overturn a dystopian future society. Or figure out why someone dropped them in a giant maze, or these poor kids, 100 of them in fact, who were sent down from a generational arc by their mean parents to fight for survival on a nuclear-ravaged Earth.
Start with how the world ended. Which time?
I mean, yikes. Multiple apocalypses? Then there's the more serious, critically acclaimed TV, like Charlie Booker's Black Mirror, a British dystopian science fiction series that explores, in Mr. Booker's words, the way we live now and the way we might be living in 10 minutes' time, if we're clumsy. Ironically, it was about 10 minutes before Netflix took Booker's name off the title, and the show became just Black Mirror. Having debuted on Channel 4 in 2011, I remember being particularly excited when they announced a new show called Utopia to launch in 2013. Finally, I thought, something with a positive outlook on the future, something that will make me feel optimistic and all warm and fuzzy inside. Look, dancing bunnies, and, oh, well, that's not what I was expecting. Great score, though, shout out to Cristobal Tapia de Veer. In fact, Utopia was so persistently dystopian that Amazon couldn't help themselves from making it again, this time with slightly less yellow and more American celebrities.
Yeah, what? That's extreme.
As for books, there's just so many sci-fi novels out there. With that disclaimer, let's start with one of the most celebrated of the past few decades. Liu Cixin's Three-Body Problem. It won the Hugo Award in 2015 and has spawned a couple of movie adaptations that are still in the works. I personally really love the series, which also includes The Dark Forest and Death's End, and I don't want to spoil it for anyone who hasn't read it. But you can probably glean from the titles that it paints a pretty troubling picture for humanity in a universe that's incredibly hostile. Seriously, just go read it. We could also take a look at Margaret Atwood, who's probably best known for The Handmaid's Tale, her Dystopia from 1985, but whose more recent dystopian series, the Mad Adam trilogy, depicts a North American landscape ravaged by ecological disaster and inhabited by a genetically modified race of quasi-humans. Atwood said of the first book, Oryx and Crake, "I think, for the first time in human history, we can see far enough into the future to know that we can't go on the way we've been going." As I said, this list really could go on, but just looking at the classics you might have read in high school, say A Brave New World, or Orwell's 1984, or Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451, all have one thing in common. They depict a future dystopia dreamed up from the worries and anxieties of their particular times and places. Can you even come up with one classic sci-fi novel that paints an optimistic future? There's Thomas More's Utopia, of course, but that was political satire, and Moore himself likely didn't believe in the possibility of a human utopia. Also, he ended up with his head on the chopping block, literally, for mostly religious reasons. So, why exactly then has science fiction been so glum? And does it have to be?
Young lady, I come from a time when men achieved power and wealth by standing on the backs of the poor, where prejudice and intolerance are commonplace and power is an end unto itself. And you're telling me that isn't how it is anymore?
That's right.
As early as 1830, British writer Thomas Babington Macaulay noted that, quote, "We cannot absolutely prove that those are in error who say society has reached a turning point, that we have seen our best days. But on what principle is it that with nothing but improvement behind us, we are to expect nothing but deterioration before us?" The interesting thing here is that Lord Macaulay just assumed that most people believed in the march of progress, that there's been, quote, "nothing but improvement behind us." Now let's jump 300 years to professor and author Steven Pinker, who started looking at surveys regarding people's opinions of the future. What he found surprised him. Most people had come to believe the opposite, that the general state of the world had been deteriorating for some time, at least since 1950 and likely since Adam left the garden, and that this downward trend would continue into the foreseeable future. A more recent study from 2015 by Melanie Randall and Richard Eckersley, titled Public Perceptions of Future Threats to Humanity and Different Societal Responses, revealed, quote, "widespread public pessimism about the future of the world, at least in Western countries, including a common perception of declining quality of life, or that future generations will be worse off." The study showed that overall, a majority, about 54%, rated the risk of our way of life ending within the next 100 years at 50% or greater. About half agreed that, quote, "the world's future looks grim, so we have to focus on looking after ourselves and those we love." This pessimistic belief didn't jibe with what Pinker viewed as historical reality, so he set out to prove it with data, culminating in his 2011 book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, Why Violence Has Declined. As one example, Pinker shows that in Europe, your chance of being murdered is now less than 1/10, and in some countries only 1/50th of what it would have been if you had lived 500 years ago. Extreme poverty, Pinker insists, has been on the decline. It's gone from 90% of the world's population to 10%. Literacy has increased from about 15% to more than 85%. Prosperity has increased. Longevity has increased from about 30 to 71 years worldwide and 80 in the developed world, and so on. The important part of all this for our discussion is why people have such a negative view of the future to begin with. Pinker, for his part, mostly blames, well, can you guess? I'll wait. That's right, the media. And it does make sense, as illustrated by this infamous headline. Besides, major news outlets around the world have become measurably more negative over the past several decades. Perhaps such a singular focus on all our many problems without much thought given to everything that has gone well, is slowly warping our beliefs away from reality and towards something darker. As we've seen, it plays out again and again in our movies, novels, and television, and may form a kind of negative feedback loop.
Fear leads to anger. Anger leads to hate. Hate leads to suffering.
The study measures people's feelings about the future, but doesn't try to ask why people might feel this way. We've already talked about the persistently negative effect of media, but another, very powerful set of reasons can be found in our psychology, or more specifically, our cognitive biases. A 2018 article from Psychology Today titled "Declinism: Why You Think America is in Crisis" explains how our minds can, quote, trick us into feeling that things are worse than they are. It points to several common cognitive biases, beginning with the reminiscence bump, or the tendency for adults to have more vivid memories and nostalgia for events that occurred during their adolescence and early adulthood. The negativity bias says that our brains evolved with a bias towards overestimating current threats and underestimating opportunities and resources. That helped keep us alive when life really was much more precarious. It explains why studies have consistently shown that people remember negative experiences more vividly than positive ones, recall insults more than praise, and so on. Another bias, confirmation bias, helps lock in all that negativity as we seek out information that supports what we already believe and reject anything that differs with our established worldview. The result of all this is that there are hardly any models of science fiction that envision an optimistic or even neutral view of the future. Still, there have been a few notable examples that serve as a sort of shining beacon among the vast wasteland of dystopian entertainments.
Space, the final frontier. These are the voyages of the Starship Enterprise. Its 5-year mission to explore strange new worlds, to seek out new life and new civilizations.
The most obvious and popular example has to be Star Trek. In 1964, in the midst of the space race that had America and the world looking at the future with more rose-colored glasses, Gene Roddenberry pitched his new show as a wagon train to the stars. From the very beginning, Roddenberry had some unusual ideas about the underpinning philosophy of the show. As he explained later, perhaps one of the primary features of Star Trek that made it different from other shows was it believed that humans are improving. They will vastly improve in the 23rd century. When Star Trek The Next Generation was launching, Roddenberry made it known to the writers that religion, superstition, and mystical thinking were not to be included. Even a mention of marriage in a script from an early episode resulted in Roddenberry chastising the writers, according to Brannon Braga, an intern at the time.
But you can't deny that you're still a dangerous, savage child race.
Most certainly I deny it.
The Star Trek ethos, and I believe the thing that has made it such an enduring favorite, was summed up best in another quote by Roddenberry. He said, "I believe in humanity. We are an incredible species. We're still just a child creature. We're still being nasty to each other. And all children go through those phases. We're growing up. We're moving into adolescence now. When we grow up, man, we're going to be something." The other science fiction utopia that's worth taking a look at is Iain Banks' Culture series of novels. Set in the distant future, the Culture is an interstellar, post-scarcity civilization created out of a symbiotic relationship between humans and the super-intelligent and powerful AIs called minds that humans created at some point in the distant past, or our future, I guess. Banks described the conceit as looking at the present issues around artificial intelligence and imagining a best-case scenario. For funsies, the Culture takes a sort of opposite view from the Federation's prime directive, meaning they tend to meddle in the affairs of every less developed civilization they encounter, steering them towards the Culture's own enlightened values. Unsurprisingly, that's where most of the action takes place.
I'd say that's slightly more important than the prime directive. Wouldn't you, Jim?
It's a very interesting proposition. Let me think it over.
One thing I haven't mentioned yet, but is probably obvious, is that it's just more fun to look at dystopian stories than optimistic ones. Sort of the same way that the news doesn't run stories with headlines like, "Things still peachy in Springfield," or "Nothing much happened in Chicago today." As such, shows like Star Trek or the Culture series tend to focus on the margins, where the rare problems do arise. In the culture novels, for example, we're often dealing with an agency called special circumstances, which often acts outside the moral values of the culture as a whole. The first culture novel was published in 1987, but it's only really been in the past decade that the series has taken off in popularity, inspiring people like Elon Musk, who named SpaceX's 2 drone ships after ships in Banks's books, the Just Read the Instructions and Of Course I Still Love You. Describing his work in a 2013 interview from The Atlantic, Banks sounds a lot like Roddenberry. Quote, "In a way, the most important message of the Culture series is that the future might be a hoot, a utopia, or at least as close to a utopia as a species similar to ourselves can hope to get, rather than a dystopia." Like with Star Trek, I think that's why the Culture novels have grown in popularity over time and have an avid fan base today. Before summing up, I should mention briefly a few of the more influential science fiction depictions of utopia that you might want to explore if you're so inclined. Edward Bellamy's Looking Backward, published in 1888, was one of the best-selling books of its time. It influenced a generation of intellectuals. In the United States alone, over 162 Bellamy clubs sprang up to discuss and propagate the book's utopian ideas. Another is from Aldous Huxley, whose final novel, The Island, provides a more optimistic argument and counterpoint to his more famous Brave New World. Ursula K. Le Guin's The Dispossessed, as well as Clifford D. Simak's The Werewolf Principle, are 2 other classic novels I would add to the Utopian Hall of Fame. "2020 has been a rough year for optimism, let alone utopian notions of the future of humanity. Still, over the past several years, I believe I've felt the ground shifting. Maybe people are just getting tired of all the post-apocalyptic wastelands adorning our high-definition TV screens, or maybe the times have finally gotten troubling enough that people are more actively searching for alternative viewpoints. I personally started reading a new book by Rutger Berman called Humankind: A Hopeful History, precisely because I was looking for something positive to balance out the news. It's sort of a companion piece to Better Angels, and uses data and history to argue the apparently radical idea that maybe people aren't so awful after all. I could go on for a lot longer on this topic, but I'd like to leave it here with a final thought from one of my favorite science fiction authors, R.A. Lafferty. In a 1979 speech titled The Day After the World Ended, he began by arguing that the apocalypse that science fiction had been so concerned with has actually already happened. Quote, "Nobody now remembers our late world very clearly. It can't be recollected because recollection is one of the things it took with it when it went." By the end of the speech, he claims that science fiction has a special place in society and culture and issues a challenge to the audience. If you are not right now making a world, why aren't you? It can be done by a small elite of only a few million geniuses. Declare yourselves one of them. A couple of hundred people here, a couple of billion there, working with uneasy brilliance, may come up with a stunning and unpredicted creation. So, I guess that's my challenge to you, and myself as well. It's what this channel is about, and I hope some of you might be willing to take the ride with me.